bit. Got it. I want to introduce Fook a little bit. Fook Mental Health Association partnership with OCASI. It is a IRCC funded project. We call them Journey to Promote Mental Health. The objections of this training is to enhance the capacity of the community workers from the settlement services sector, and in addressing and dealing with mental health issues presented by the individuals that they serve. Our consistent is essentials mental health training and putting the knowledge into practice. So this morning we have our guest speaker, Dr. Albert Allen. I would like to introduce Dr. Albert Allen. He is a psychiatrist who trained in the University of Calgary. And he completed his residency at U of T in Toronto. And he worked there until 2015 in the University of Toronto of Counseling Psychological Services. And he is currently a consultant at Fook Mental Health Clinic. Okay, and he also is having ADHD clinic. Dr. Allen currently clinical interest in the area of assessment and treatment and psychopharmacology in the area of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, anxiety disorder, mood disorder, and he also have an interest in mindfulness-based treatment. So ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Dr. Albert Allen.
Okay, thanks, Emily. So the bio is a bit old now. I don't work at the ADHD clinic anymore. So most of the work I do is up north for the Sioux Lookout First Nations Health Authority. So welcome everybody, and thanks for being here today. I hope to share some kind of useful ideas or information with everybody. Just to give a bit of background about this talk, it came out of a presentation last year for Fook. Some of the workers were sort of dealing with this situation where they had clients who had, their people had died during the earlier part of the pandemic, and it was kind of an unusual situation, couldn't go in to be with people in the hospital or kind of attend a funeral in person. So they were wondering about how to navigate that situation and asked me to look into it and try to come up with something. So a lot of the slides are focused on grief and mourning for people who had passed away. But I understand that participants, mostly settlement workers, and so there may be kind of helping people with loss more in a general sense, not necessarily people who have passed away, but other kinds of change or loss of roles or identity or ways of life previously. So so hopefully the ideas here, some of it is focused on grief, but will also apply in a more general sense to other kinds of loss and stress and change. So I think maybe we could do the poll. So we had something set up just to ask people about what are your interests or learning priorities in coming here, and that might help me to sort of focus in on certain things and less focus on others. So is it like specifically grief, or is it other kinds of loss, or just generally stress dealing with change? So I just asked to pick two out of three, and we'll see what are the main learning needs for today.
Okay, I'm just looking at the results from the poll coming in. So it looks like for the first grief and bereavement is at 70%, and resilience and adapting to change 85%. So those two seem to be the main focus, and then other kinds of loss is at 28%. So a little lower.
Okay. Oh, that's great. So I think most of the slides are actually about grief and bereavement, and there's some towards the end about resilience. So so the slides that I put in about grief should be pretty useful then. So that's perfect. So we will definitely go through that then. So talk about tasks of mourning, like the psychological process people go through when someone passes away, and then how to support people's resilience to go through not only that, but other kinds of stress or change too. So I think another thing I would mention at the beginning is like some of the material might be geared towards like more like mental health professional people, because that was like the original audience. But I sort of tried to adapt it for more of a general audience. So these aren't like sort of special therapy techniques that you need to have a lot of training or a license to use. Like resilience is a human quality, like everybody has it and can cultivate it, and we all need it because we're all dealing with change and losses at some point. So I'm hoping that the things that we talk about are things that you can just apply and try out. Maybe you do it already in your own life, and then if you're working with people who are going through something, then you can just kind of share from your experience, like what's been helpful for you, and then it's not like you're doing some kind of psychotherapy work or sort of operating outside the scope of your practice. It's just kind of like being a person and being with somebody else. So let's go on ahead. So we'll talk about like sort of ordinary resilience, and if things are not complicated, what does the mourning process generally look like, and how people move through that, and how to support them with that. There is a little bit of information, I think, about like when the mourning is not quite normal, or it's complicated, or it gets stuck, and what that's like, and some of the reasons for that. But I think it might not be so relevant if you're not like trying to do mental health treatment, so I won't dwell on that so much. And then there's some ideas about like when people are passing away during the pandemic, how did that change the process, and maybe some adaptations we might be able to make as a society. That may be like less and less relevant now, if like hopefully we are getting past the sort of isolation and lockdown part of the last couple of years, but we don't really know what will happen in the future. So those ideas might come in handy too. And possibly could be a bit of Q&A too. I don't know, with the number of participants, it might be like so much that this will have to be more like a webinar than a sort of interactive thing. But if there's some questions at the end, maybe if we have time, I'll try to go through that. So yeah, just go through some definitions to start, just so we're kind of on the same page with terminology. And there's a graphic on, I think it's on the next slide, that helps to illustrate this. So stress is like some kind of strain on a person from some kind of challenging circumstances that are like taxing or kind of outside of our comfort zone. Grief is a kind of stress, like it's the reaction to a loss. So we can talk about grief like in the specific sense of somebody has passed away, but we can also use the term to say, well, we're grieving some other kind of loss, like a loss of a relationship or a job. And then mourning is the kind of work that you do with the grief, like to resolve it. And often we use them interchangeably, but yeah, like in an academic or technical sense, it's not exactly the same thing. And then when we say bereavement, that means like the condition that you're in when somebody you love has passed away. So then you're in a state of bereavement. So having experienced the loss, grief is your reaction to the loss, and then the mourning is the process that you kind of resolve that or get out of it. And the trauma is some like stress that's like deeply disturbing, or something happens that overwhelms our capacity to cope with it, and it leaves some negative effects after. We call that trauma. So yeah, in this slide we can see like trauma, bereavement, loss, like those are all forms of stress. And then bereavement is a particular kind of loss. And then some losses and some bereavement is traumatic, but not all of it is. And arguably, there's some kinds of trauma that are not, that don't involve loss, but often it does. So yeah, so today what we'll be talking about, I don't know if this annotation thing works, but oh, okay, maybe not. Okay, actually maybe it will. Sorry, just seeing if I can draw on this slide here. Yeah, so yeah, so we'll be talking about the bereavement more today, but what we discuss with bereavement will be more broadly applicable to dealing with other kinds of loss and also with stress, because the bereavement is sort of a subset of those other experiences. So when we have some kind of normal or uncomplicated grief, or dealing with any kind of change, people go through a certain process. Like at first there's a sort of shock or disbelief, denial, and then kind of this process of struggling with the emotions related to that, and then having some kind of resolution. Like it's kind of like all of this emotion comes up and it needs to pass through us and be released. And if it doesn't get stuck, then we have some peace with that. And so we can kind of go back to living our lives, engaging with other activities. If it's a loss, that might involve like finding new ways to do things without the person who's passed away, investing in new relationships, being able to think about the person without being overwhelmed with negative emotion. And there might be some growth that comes from it. Like you may come out like having some insight that you didn't have before, or some new capacities that developed during this process of struggle. So we see this like of course when we're dealing with bereavement, but just even on a day-to-day basis, you face some kind of challenge, and if you're able to kind of accept it, engage with it, resolve it, then you overcome that challenge. So this is a very normal, like everyday thing that people do all the time. And so in keeping with that, like most people actually do fine when they lose somebody. Like it's a challenging experience, but the norm is that people are able to cope with it. So only a minority of people end up like having some kind of chronic grief, or where they struggle for years and years. And probably the majority of people don't even really have significant distress. So we can say then that it's the normal experience most of the time is for people to be resilient. Like just living systems in general, like they encounter some stress, and that stress stimulates them to grow and become like increase their capacities or become stronger. And so it's a kind of just put this observation in for interest sake, that if you deprive people of healthy stress, then they actually become weaker. Like if you have people in space for a long time where there's no gravity, then their muscles start to atrophy and they become physically weaker. Or if you have plants that you grow indoors and they don't have any sort of breeze blowing or any kind of environmental stress, everything's like perfect all the time, then when you bring them outside, they have quite a shock and they might die. So we do need some challenges in life in order to, well, to stay alive and stay healthy. So,
Dr. Allen, we have a
yeah.
few questions. I'd like to read this for you, and I think this is
Okay.
important. How long is it's called normal, so-called normal, to pass on that phase of that, and then and if this is how long can this period last, and what does some of the trauma that what are some of the type of trauma that don't involve loss? What about the loss of the child?
Oh, gosh, wow. So many things. Okay.
Yeah, because there's
so,
a lot of
yeah.
questions that it comes to me and it's missing, it's all gone somewhere, and I want you to have that to keep in mind.
Okay. Yeah, the loss of a child, maybe. Yeah, I guess we could come back to that one. That one may be like particularly difficult or traumatic because we have expectations that that kind of thing should not happen. And it's easier for us to cope with some kind of expected loss, like an old elderly person who develops an illness, or somebody who's been sick for a while and kind of slowly declining, they're going to pass away. So we might talk a bit more about things that might help with that. Yeah, just in terms of like enhancing resilience and openness and coping with negative emotions. Trauma that doesn't involve a loss. Well, yeah, I think if you think about it, you might find a loss in in most kinds of trauma. Like if somebody has been attacked or they've been involved in something that's kind of morally damaging to them, you might say there's been like a loss of integrity or a loss of identity or a loss of sense of security. Yeah, so maybe that is the case, that usually it involves losing something, but yeah, not always losing a person or losing something physical, or losing a relationship. And then trying to remember what the first question was. Oh, how long it should take. So I had another slide in here and I took it out, but I think we generally say like after about a year, like people are, at least in the North American context, are expected to sort of be able to kind of go back to work and be like engaging in their relationships with other people again. So yeah, so the process of kind of remembering and working through things like that may take longer than that. And then just anecdotally, I read that people may have like sort of outpourings of emotion for quite some time, like maybe years afterwards. But just in terms of being able to function, the year, 1 year is like kind of the general number. And if it's like longer than that, where you can't work or you're feeling very depressed, very down, then you start referring people to see the psychiatrist. So, and that may be a situation of complicated grief, which is what we're talking about on this slide, that if the grief is like so intense, it overwhelms the person, they can't kind of get back on their feet and go back to being able to function. If it just goes on and on and on, doesn't resolve, or there's some kind of maladaptive or harmful behavior like self-harming, self-sabotaging, risk-taking, alcohol or drug abuse, like those things, we say, okay, that's not a normal or healthy process of grief. And so some of the ways that grief can be complicated is like if it's chronic, like it just lasts so long and doesn't resolve, or there's like delayed grief where the person doesn't apparently show any reaction at first, and then it may all come out later. Like this is like if, say, somebody loses somebody and they seem fine, like nothing, it doesn't phase them at all, and then a couple years later, like their dog dies or something, and then they have this huge kind of overwhelming reaction. So it's like the grief has been suppressed and not worked through, and then there's a small trigger later on, and then everything blows out. And then the exaggerated grief is like it's just way too much emotion, or the grief is like masked, which is a bit similar to the delayed grief, but it just doesn't come out, like it's very suppressed. Like maybe the person has a conflict about some of the emotion that's coming out, and they're not allowing themselves to feel that, and so everything is just bottled up. And this was the stuff that I didn't want to dwell on too much, because like interesting, or if you are a therapist, it's yeah, interesting to know. But like, yeah, I imagine like if you encounter something like this and it seems like just it's not getting better, then you might refer that person to see like a professional, and wouldn't be trying to deal with this yourself. And so trying to focus more on how to support the majority of people who will be going through a loss but will have normal resilience, and just mention that. So those are some of the ways that grief could be complicated. And so how we draw the line between like grief and like major depression, like the clinical disorder, there's some kind of flags or warning signs, like if they're feeling really guilty or worthless, or they're having suicidal thoughts, that's not usually a part of normal grief. In especially the early period, bereaved people can have like the other symptoms of major depression, like loss of appetite, trouble sleeping, not being motivated or interested in things they usually enjoy, low energy. But those depressive symptoms usually get better within a couple months. Yeah, if somebody is going through a complicated grief, they may have like symptoms of depression for longer, or they may have some of these like kind of red flags that their grief is not the normal grief, like if they're suicidal, for example. And then if there was like a traumatic aspect to the bereavement, then the person may have symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, like having flashbacks or reliving the experience, hypervigilance, not being able to relax, getting startled easily, avoiding things because it triggers a traumatic response. So that's another way that somebody might have a like a mental health disorder that's connected to the loss. So that like trauma, PTSD, like that's also another topic altogether, but just mentioning that here. So if we kind of go back to the more like normal process of mourning, what needs to happen for somebody to get from that kind of shock phase through the struggle and then to resolution. So Warden described these 4 tasks that sort of correspond with that more general process of adaptation. So first you have to accept the loss, then you have to process the painful emotions, and then there's a kind of behavioral and cognitive adjustment, like figuring out how to live in this new world that doesn't have the person that you lost in it. And then finding some way to move on in a healthy way, like how do you stay connected to them in a good way while living your life. So maybe keeping a positive memory of them in their heart, and then renewing ties with other people and engaging with the world again. So yeah, you can kind of see how this process sort of overlaps with that general concept of dealing with stress. Like accepting the loss is kind of like the initial shock, or the sometimes people have a kind of denial or disbelief, and then getting past that, then there's the struggle part, like processing the emotions and then adjusting, and then resolution, you're kind of made peace with the situation, and then your energy comes back so you can do other things. So yeah, with the first task, really somebody who's bereaved has to accept that the person they love is really gone. So any kind of big change or shock, there may be like a kind of denial or unable to believe or accept that this has happened, or it just feels kind of unreal. And so for people to kind of do this task of accepting, they need to have support and safety. And so that is like social support and having connection with other people who are kind of validating what they're going through, and also having some structure in life, I think also helps with that, like getting, keeping some of the old routines and familiar things gives people a sense of comfort. And I think that's, yeah, that's very important, is yeah, like we see some situations like this, like up north, where there's like forest fires seem to happen every year now, and sometimes the communities have to be evacuated, and the people have to go stay in a hotel, like in Thunder Bay, um, or one of the cities, and so their life, their routine is like um, totally disrupted, and I think that makes it much more difficult to cope with all of the other stress that they already have. Um, so. So I think where we can, it's very important for people to be able to kind of do the things that they're familiar with. Um, So when people are going through this kind of phase of loss, and they often need to talk about it, um, sometimes you have people just talking about it over and over and over and over, and you feel like, oh my God, like, yeah, I get it. But they need to do it for themselves. Um, so if they are able to say it and somebody listens to it and kind of, validates that, yes, this happened, then it starts to feel more real. It sinks in. And so this may be an important reason why, we have some kind of rituals or ceremonies when people pass away. There's some kind of funeral process so that the the community gets together, and there's this collective validation of the experience. Um, this this really happened, so that the people who are close to that person can like accept, or they say actualize, the loss. Um, so yeah, already mentioned the funeral. Some of the other things that people do is they might bring the body home and just have the body in the home, and preparing the body, cleaning, dressing it. Um, Maybe we don't do that so much anymore, but I think, um, yeah, in some cultures it's important. And also, yeah, visiting. If you couldn't go to the funeral, then uh, visiting the grave, or visiting the marker to pay respects also, I think, is like a physical representation of that loss, and that helps things to sink in. Uh, yeah, so that's one of the things that people can do, like especially if they were not able to attend, or the loss happens and they're somewhere else living in a different community and couldn't make it to the funeral, then um, being able to go and visit, um, yes, somehow I find that kind of helps to get the mourning process going if it hasn't started. Like it's just, getting distracted, doing other things, haven't really thought about it, then the psychological work doesn't start. So one of the challenges then during the pandemic has been, how do you do this? I think in some ways it was really challenging for people because, um, like, unless they were a very immediate family, they might not have been able to go to the funeral. Even the immediate family, like, they go to the funeral, but they couldn't get that community support of everybody coming together. So yeah, I think that has been a big challenge to navigate. And so some things that people seem to be doing is like having things online, kind of like this workshop is online. So um, if people couldn't participate in person, they could kind of come in virtually. And yeah, I think for the person attending virtually, that is probably better than nothing, that you can participate in something and be part of that experience. And so that helps to do your own work. Um, maybe, yeah, for the people who are attending in person, it might not be quite the same. Like if you don't have that kind of people's presence there for support, but I think probably knowing that some other people are witnessing this experience um, is, yeah, that probably provides some kind of comfort too. Yeah, and then something I just noticed myself like seemed helpful was having some kind of obituary, like some kind of notification that um, that the person died. And I think it would be helpful to have some details about them, their life, their relations, um, just so you can kind of know or understand more about the loss, and it feels real. Like for me, in my situation, it was like one of the instructors at a gym that I go to or went to before, like passed away during the pandemic. And I didn't know him that well, but um, some things that were helpful is like that there was this kind of virtual ceremony to just to remember, honor him. And I think that helped, because otherwise it would have just kind of been like, okay, well, I saw him like before the pandemic, and then now he's just gone. Like, well, what does that mean? But they didn't share a lot of information like about him, like who was his family. Yeah, a little bit more information about his life, how he died. So I still don't know, and I think that that kind of information probably would have been helpful, like just to, um, yeah, just to feel that sense of knowing what happened. um, so, yeah, another aspect of like having the reality of the loss sink in is like thinking about secondary losses. Because of course the person has passed away, the connection that you had with them has definitely changed, like maybe not entirely cut, but you can't see them in person anymore. But then there's so many other things, like maybe you had a future imagine that's like kind of incorporates that person, and they're a big part of how you envisioned your life would go, or things that you would do. Or maybe there's other things that they were very important in doing or supporting, like just practical matters, getting things done, maybe around the house, or the financial support, income, being an emotional support, or somebody that you did a certain kind of activity with or some kind of work with, then all of that changes too. And so that is also a kind of loss to cope with. And so sometimes just like spending some time to think about that and be aware of like, hey, what exactly am I mourning right now? Helps to kind of clarify that. So yeah, where these ideas apply to other kinds of loss is those other losses have to feel real, or it has to feel final, for us to start going through the mourning process. And so this is a way that people may get stuck. Like, say, example is like end of a relationship. If you have some, say, secret hope in your heart that you can get back together, it's not really over, or it's just temporary, then you're not going to go through the work of mourning. You maybe just kind of waiting, or seeing, oh, maybe this is not the end, maybe we can get back together. So So in those cases, people sometimes need some proof, or they really need to hear it, or something definitive, so they know, like, yeah, this really happened. This is really over. It's kind of, yeah, I guess the corresponding idea, like with bereavement, is like where there's situations where people pass away, but it's ambiguous. Like they say they went somewhere and they disappear, and nobody really knows what happened to them. So in that case, it's very difficult for the families to go through the mourning, because there's this idea like, oh, well, maybe they ran away, maybe they're hiding, maybe they don't want to be found, maybe they haven't died. So until they have some proof, or if they can see the body, they may not be able to really move on to the next step, or it's very difficult to do so. So, so this task happens, like the reality of the situation sinks in. You accept, like, yes, this is real. This really happened. Then there's all this emotion that comes out. So, and this is like dealing with this painful emotions, like a big part of what I do, like just professionally. Like this is like relevant to so many kinds of situations where people might need help. So the general, these are the ideas that, you know, or kind of conclusions that I've come to about emotions, that they have some kind of useful purpose. Like maybe sadness prompts you to like look inward, reflect on something, remember. Anger might motivate you to correct something that's not right. If you have feelings of guilt, it's often like a healthy guilt anyways, because you made a mistake, and then the guilt will motivate you to correct that, make amends, or at least not to do something like that again in the future. So so it's necessary to experience the emotion and allow the emotion to be there, so that we can get something from the emotion, or learn what we need to learn from it. and so, like, people tend to have difficulties because they get stuck somehow in this process. Like they want to avoid the emotion, or block it, and so it gets stuck. So ideally, I think it's important for people to allow the emotion to feel it, and kind of understand it in some way. Like, what is it supposed to do? What is it trying to show me or teach me? And then the emotion leaves. It kind of circulates out of us. So people can get blocked or stuck, like, because they avoid emotions. But in some situations, it seems to me that people have a different kind of problem, where it's kind of like they love that emotion too much, or it's like so familiar to them. It's a part of their identity, and they can't let it go. And it's sort of like they're sort of habitually creating these emotions and getting stuck with them. So people who are kind of, used to being sad, and they look for sad situations in the world, or they listen to sad music, and it's, to an outside observer, it's kind of something not right about that. Like, it's sort of like entertainment almost. So they hold on to that emotion too much, and so either kind of stuckness, like avoiding it, pushing it away, or getting stuck on it, it seems unhealthy. So have to allow it, but not hold on to it. Sometimes just listening to people and being with them, kind of a non-specific factor in doing therapy. We say like it's the relationship, it's the space, it's co-regulation, like being with somebody who's calm helps you to be calm. Like there's something about creating space that may help this process, like people feel safe enough to allow themselves to experience an emotion. Um, and also there may be something about like modeling too, where if they can see, like, especially if they get stuck on an emotion, or they're like always like sad, or they're always angry, like it may be helpful that just to see like, oh, like there's some other way of being that somebody can like not hold on to these, or they might have a different way of feeling. So yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack with all of this, and we might not be able to kind of discuss that whole topic, but just to kind of give a sense or an idea of what this might look like how do you do this and how to support people through that. Yeah, so one of the difficulties that people who are bereaved like may encounter is that like people don't really want to listen to them, or they have all this negative emotion, but other people aren't comfortable with it. And so this is where you get these platitudes, like where you just say something to somebody just to kind of shut down the conversation, like, oh, everything's going to be all right, don't worry, everything happens for a reason. Um, like it's kind of a pat statement that sort of feels insulting to people, because um, maybe it's not necessarily what you say or the content of it, but it's like the function of that is kind of communicates that like, I don't want to deal with you, don't want to deal with how you're feeling. So yeah, this is something maybe like kind of subjective, like you have to be aware of yourself, or what are your motivations, or what's coming up in you about this. Like, are you really able to be there for the person, or is this making you uncomfortable in some way? And then you kind of have to do this internal work to be okay with sitting with somebody, and then you can be a better support for them. Yeah, so this here was about that scenario I mentioned before, like if people can't let go of an emotion, like they get so used to it. So the example is like somebody who feels always hard done by, and then something bad happens to them, and it's like, oh, this is another example of how my life is so difficult, or so challenging. And in those cases, I think you can't really like argue with the person or say like, well, it's not like that, like, because that kind of process or holding on to this serves some kind of important function to them. So you can't just take it away, or they'll get defensive or sort of fight you about it. So yeah, so this is something that I think that like a therapist would more deal with. And so if it's just kind of as a lay person, like trying to help somebody like that, you might just recognize that there's reasons for them holding on to this. And so we kind of more want to accept them as they are, but like help them explore that and reflect on this. Like, what's the function of this? Like, why might you hold on like this, and what other options might there be? Like, how else could your life look? And just kind of open up more possibilities for the person. So you might just tell them something like, wow, it looks like it's really hard for you, and maybe you're kind of getting a bit stuck somehow on this. So do you think maybe it would help to talk to somebody, and just to invite, you sort of open your hand and say, this is something I can do, and then it's ultimately up to them. So you're not fighting them, but you're suggesting things or giving some options. Positive emotion is important too. Like we might come back to this talking about resilience, but in order to sort of metabolize or process or cope with a strong negative emotion, it seems to me anyway that it's very important to be able to bring some kind of positive emotion, like and I don't mean it's like, oh, I'm sad, so I'm just gonna like go to an amusement park and just entertain myself and like just be happy, 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 and kind of have this denial of what's negative. But it's kind of like we need to bring them together. Um, so yeah, if we're feeling sad, then having some compassion for ourselves to allow that, take care of ourselves, say, okay, yeah, I see this. I see that I'm struggling. I see that I'm sad. Let me take care of myself and just, let that sadness come. Let me look at it and feel it and maybe learn from it. It's more that kind of emotion or attitude, because there are certainly other ways we can you can bring a negative emotion to a negative emotion, like you feel sad and you get angry at yourself for feeling sad, and I shouldn't feel this way and I wish this would go away. That tends to kind of make things more tense and more difficult. So these kind of emotions that help us to feel relaxed, to feel safe, that kind of opens us. So when your nervous system is in this more calm state, then your mind works better. You can think more flexibly and creatively. You can connect with people more. That stuff could be another talk as well. But just to say that being able to experience some positive emotion helps, even when you're experiencing a negative emotion. So, yeah, this is kind of, it's a bit challenging for me to describe verbally, but yeah, like something of what having the positive emotion allows us to do is have some kind of relaxation inside. So when we experience something that we don't like, there's this kind of tension, like we want to clamp down, the body becomes tense, and then you have these kind of rejecting emotions like frustration, anger, disappointment. So in order for that emotion to circulate and be released, then we need to kind of open up somehow, let go of this internal resistance. So there's an aspect of that that's like, I think, mental or cognitive, like to say, yes, this is okay. I'm gonna allow this. There's a physical aspect of like releasing tension in the body, and an emotional aspect of trying to bring this kind of allowing, accepting, compassion, kindness, emotion, to bring that up. And then if we can bring those factors together, I think that's a big part of resilience. When you're kind of relaxed like this, you're flexible. Like resilience has that connotation of being able to bend but not break. And I think that is something you can feel subjectively, is some kind of quality that I'm trying to paint a picture or describe it, but you can feel it in yourself. So some examples of the positive emotions. I mean, there is the stuff I mentioned, like compassion or kindness, but also just being curious about something, gratitude, sense of awe, like, wow, there's so much in the world, there's so much to learn, or this miraculous quality of life. So it can be helpful even when somebody is going through mourning to do some things to try to connect with some of those feelings, just to allow them to stay open, like getting some exercise, going outside, being in nature, doing some familiar activity that gives them some comfort, hanging out with the kids, washing the dishes if you like doing that, or you can do that mindfully. Um, so yeah, so we talk about processing the emotion, opening up, allowing the emotion to circulate, and then there's just making the adjustments to this new world, this new life, to this change. So that there's external changes, internal changes, spiritual changes, like all kinds of things. So there might be stuff that you do outside, like the person who was earning most of the income in the household has passed away. Now I need to go to work, or I need to learn some skills or learn a trade so that I can start doing that, or maybe need to get some help with childcare, or need to find some other people to confide in, or some other people to play sports with, or whatever it is. Just that sort of practical adjustment, and then there's some internal adjustments too, like changing how we see ourselves, how we see our lives. For example, that loss of a child, like there's this aspect of identity, like, okay, I'm a father, I'm a parent. Now what am I? Mhm.
الحمد لله الحمد لله هذا لو في عين.
Oh, sorry. Just maybe somebody's mic was turned on. But yeah, so internal changes, maybe finding new source of self-esteem, or shift in the sense of identity, and then that kind of overlaps with some spiritual changes too. So this kind of like bigger picture things, changes in worldview, understanding of life, the meaning of life. So maybe you can relate to this too, like there's some change that happens, like, oh, I never thought it would happen to me, or gosh, like if I was living my life and like kind of following this track, and like that leads to this, then and all of this pain, maybe I need to go in a different direction, or maybe there's more to life. So like when I was in medical school, I kind of had something like this where I wouldn't say it was like a kind of loss. Maybe this is an example of something trauma that doesn't have a big loss, but I went through like a big illness scare, where I had like an exposure during work, and then I had to go have this testing to see if I would get hepatitis or not, and everything turned out fine. But that sort of opened up like a whole other aspect of life to me. Like I previously had just been on this kind of materialistic track, like, oh, I'm gonna get this degree, and then I'll have a secure income, and I'll just be able to do whatever I want, and I'll be self-sufficient. And that was like my vision of life. And then going through that experience is like, well, yeah, something like that could happen at any time, or your plans that you made like could be just kind of messed up, or something might throw a wrench in it. So then how are you going to deal with that? Or how do you think about life then? And so for me, that kind of helped to show me like, oh, there's must be other things to to think about like relationships with people, some other sense of meaning or purpose. And so going through a loss, going through bereavement could also result in something like that. I don't think it does for everybody, but for some people, I think that's a part of it. So making these adjustments like that might involve like a kind of reflection process, like just to sit and think, or maybe to journal and write about, or that could be like a conversation to have. And I had many conversations, that time earlier in my life. So yeah, that could be also a way you might support somebody going through a loss. Like if they're going through this process, maybe they need to figure that out. Like how are they going to adjust? So yeah, we talked about the spiritual changes already. Just to mention, like that is not necessarily like a religious experience or require any sort of spiritual belief, but maybe just something more mundane, like just life is precious. It's important to love people while we're here, something like that. And so maybe we'll talk a bit about post-traumatic growth, but this is like something like that, going through a traumatic or challenging experience that then opens you up to a different possibility or different capacity that you didn't know was there before. And then we're moving on to the resolution phase, like making peace with what happened and then kind of entering the stream again, or going into carrying on with life. So yeah, when someone passes away, there's like a change in the relationship. Like it's not like it totally cuts and you just like forget the person, but it's kind of like how do you stay connected to the past but also move into the future, so you can keep that memory, but invest your energy into like other things, other aspects of life, people who are still there, so your energy isn't all like bound up in the past. So I think once the loss is processed, like you clear out those negative emotions, you make the adjustments that you need to make, then there is a lot of positive that remains, like happy things that you did with the person, good memories, gratitude for the time that you had together. Maybe it becomes a resource, like somebody you think about when you need some compassion, or you need a sense of comfort. So yeah, so there's a lot positive that people can stay connected to, and then they can bring that to their life. So one of the ways, maybe a very important way of staying connected, is to have some kind of ritual. Like we talked about rituals like funerals for actualizing the loss, but there's also rituals for staying connected too. And at least from research that's been done about this, it's a very highly individualized process. So like people just find their own way. Like there's an activity that they do maybe that reminds them of the person, so they do that. Like maybe a guy went fishing with his father a lot. After his father passes away, he might go to the same spot, maybe take his son there, and doing that activity, he feels connected to the past, to his father. So so that those kinds of things, like people, every relationship is different. So I think every of those rituals might be very, very different or private. Um, yeah, but just in general, like, paying homage to the person, writing a eulogy, or some favorite activity to do together, creating some kind of tradition. Some other things that I've read about is like passing along meaningful possessions to people who would use them well, and that's a way of kind of keeping the legacy of that person alive. Yeah, it's so those are some ideas, but certainly it's not limited to that. Yeah, so post-traumatic growth, one of my supervisors, he called it the gold in the wound. So after you go through a difficulty, then you might get something from it, that maybe something very valuable. People often have this experience, but I think it doesn't always happen, and so we don't want to like set up this expectation like, oh, well, you have to have some kind of profound experience or some kind of growth, or has to change you for the better, because we don't want to like blame people or make them feel like, oh, well, I didn't get anything from it. There's something wrong with me. It often does. I think it's helpful to know about the possibility, just to be open to that, something bad is not always entirely bad. Some good could come of it, but we don't want to make it like a platitude, I guess, like to say like, oh, well, there's always a silver lining or something good always happens, because maybe that person's experience in that moment is not that. But yeah, some examples of this is the this sense of wonder, appreciation of life, discovering strengths that they didn't know they had, exploring different aspects of identity. Yeah, change in relationship patterns, and then the spiritual changes too. So, what makes it more likely that we can experience this gold in the wound? So the resilience, I think, is a big part of that, like to be open and being able to relax enough that we can be open to receiving things from life. Because if we're closed up and we say, I don't want this, I don't want to feel this way, I just want it to be over with, then yeah, you can't have any positive that might come of it either. Yeah, some other things that I read about might contribute is like sharing the experience with others. Maybe that helps with making meaning, having a kind of collective experience. That makes another case for funerals, like just to share the experience. Yeah, for people to come together and sort of participate in the event. Yeah, it certainly seems different to me somehow, like if it's a collective experience, and also like kind of reflecting and integrating the experience. That's where like maybe keeping a journal can be helpful, because like maybe you did learn something or you had some kind of positive change, but you didn't notice it or you haven't been thinking about it, and creating that narrative helps you to recognize what happened. So yeah, this part of the talk is we might get through things pretty quickly and have some time for questions at the end. But yeah, just what can we do to support somebody who's mourning? And so this is really just a summary, I think, of things that have come up in what we discussed previously. Just some practical support might help so that you can take some of the load off and they can focus more on their internal process. And then connecting with them, having the social support, that social validation, somebody to talk to if they need to just talk for a while so that it sinks in. That the talking is important, I think, for so many of these phases, like accepting what's happened, working through the emotion, working out how to adjust, and then even thinking about the future, talking about goals, talking about their vision for life going forward. So, to talk to somebody, be there for them, that's quite a gift. And yeah, especially I think when people pass away, like there is this initial outpouring of support, but then everybody's kind of goes back to their usual life and routine. And then after a few months, like people stop reaching out, but they may still need that connection and support. So yeah, when people need to talk about the loss and so that it feels real, it can be actually quite helpful to ask for details or invite them at least to talk about those things, like so you create space for them, like not to satisfy your own curiosity, but it just, yeah, like, how did they die? When did this happen? How did you find out? Where were you? Like there's some reason to ask those things, because allowing space for the person to talk about it then helps them to process the experience and feel like, this really happened, and I'm telling somebody about it, and they're kind of validating that. So yeah, I didn't mention too much before, but one of the reasons why grief can become complicated and get stuck is losses that are not socially validated or not socially accepted. Then the mourning gets blocked because the person doesn't have that support to feel like this is a real loss. So the loss of a pregnancy or pregnancy termination can be that kind of loss. I don't think it is for everybody. Like, they don't always all feel the same way, but if somebody really feels a big loss, then I think as other people, like, we need to validate that. Otherwise, they might feel kind of like, well, it seems like so important to me, but nobody else seems to think so or recognize that, and so there's this disconnect, and they're not able to just feel whatever they feel and have that experience. And then there's some also like kind of taboo losses. So pregnancy termination could be like that, but yeah, suicide is another one where people sometimes may feel like they can't talk about it, and if they can't talk about it, then it makes it very hard to go through that internal process. And then another situation where the validation may be important is this kind of like ambiguous loss, like somebody has disappeared. Yeah, then having that social validation that they're gone, nobody's been able to find them, haven't been able to find the body, but let's do a ceremony to recognize this so that you can start to get some closure. I think that, yeah, that could be quite helpful. So, yeah, things to not do. We talked about the platitudes, offering kind of quick solutions or answers, like, you know, if the person's saying, why did this happen? Why did this happen? It maybe just because they are working through that, or they're kind of letting the reality of the situation settle in. So they don't necessarily want you to say like, well, it happened because of that person's karma, or it happened because, you know, it's God's will that this should happen. Like they don't necessarily need you to tell them, or if they're questioning, it's not because they want an answer from you. So I mean, it's different if they ask you like specifically, like, well, what do you think about this, or can you share something with me about your perspective because it might help me. Then sure, if you ask them like, is this what you want from me? Is this okay for me to share this with you? But otherwise, you may be doing it more for yourself than for them. So again, like if you say like, oh, well, you know, this happened to me, or like, you know, when my mom died, like this is how it was, or this is what I did, so this is what you should do. That might also feel invalidating too, because you're sort of shifting the taking space for yourself and not giving them the space that they need. And it may be indicative, like maybe if there's something going on with you, like you're feeling uncomfortable about this and you need to kind of deflect. So asking how are you today, that was something I came across too, that it maybe it implies a bit more that you're actually interested in what the answer is, recognizing that it may change day to day and you want to know, how are you doing right now? Instead of saying it's like, you know, how are you in general? How are things? So, yeah, just reflecting on what we talked about today might be helpful too, in guiding like what you do, like just thinking about where this person is at and maybe like what might they need right now. So are they in that sort of initial disbelief phase, and maybe you just need to just listen to them, or attend a ceremony and provide like just your presence and support and validation? Are they going through some emotions, and maybe kind of, you know, sit and breathe and be calm and hold space for them? Are they sort of needing to adjust to life and, you know, think about some practical matters? And then maybe, you know, if you're doing more like social work kinds of things, you might be able to help a lot with that, like be suggesting some resources or some options, kind of like brainstorming together. And yeah, if they're thinking about like moving forward, moving on, like that can be like an especially how to say, like maybe poignant or sort of rewarding time to be talking to somebody or involved with them, because it's like, you know, they might be at the point where they're thinking like, how do I make something beautiful? Like, how do I create a legacy? How do I keep this person's memory alive in a good way? So they might be thinking about like, yeah, finding new activities, doing things to commemorate the person. People often have this kind of, I think somebody called it like a co-destiny, something that they're doing together, even though they're not together now. I think the example was like a father kind of carrying on with some kind of charitable work, say, that his son found very meaningful. And then it was like now something they are kind of doing together in a way, like he feels the presence of his son when he's doing this charitable work. So I think it could be quite rewarding to witness that, to be there when somebody is sort of thinking about or working through planning something like this. Oh yeah, so then there's this section is about the resilience. So I think this was actually the thing that people were most interested in learning. So we have a good amount of time to talk about that. Yeah, so yeah, maybe a little bit changing gears a bit. So we talked about like, how do you support somebody who's going through a loss after the loss has happened? This is kind of more about like, how can we help ourselves, and maybe sort of, you know, what can people do to prepare themselves so that they're in a better state, they have more capacity when they do go through a loss, because it's inevitable. Right? One of the contemplations in Buddhism, for example, is like, at some point you're going to have some loss, or you're going to get sick, or you're going to lose something that's important to you. So this is going to be helpful at some point. Resilience. So I mentioned before, it's very ordinary. Like, it's what I find more and more is that, like, it's just a very normal thing. It's nothing kind of exotic or out there, or special. Well, it is special, but it's not. It's not rare. It's not hard to find. So, yeah, like the people who seem to be very resilient or have a lot of kind of spiritual attainment, which I think overlaps a lot with ordinary resilience, is they're like that in a very ordinary way. Like, they're just kind of very normal people that you like being around, because they're like just very healthy, and healthy is like kind of normal. It's not something way out there. So yeah, if people are resilient, it kind of has this connotation of being able to adapt, being flexible, able to bend. It's kind of the opposite of being like very brittle and hard and resistant. So you kind of resist moving, and then you snap. So you want to be like kind of the opposite of that. So yeah, there's different ways of talking about this, and I kind of done workshops that are like all about this. So we might not be able to go into super detail today, but yeah, spiritual attainment, internal relaxation, low internal tension. Those are different ways of talking about resilience, I think. Yeah, heart rate coherence, high vagal tone, those are some kind of technical or scientific things, like people trying to research like, how do these qualities correlate with physiological processes. So if you have a high vagal tone, it means your parasympathetic nervous system is dominant, and you have a high capacity to move with relaxation. So when you have some stress, your body is able to kind of adapt in a gentle way, like just release more energy to adapt to the stress, but not needing to like kick in this sympathetic nervous system, like fight or flight response, in order to be able to get through this situation. So you can do it in a very kind of nuanced, flexible, calm way. So yeah, what I was trying to get at before is like, you can talk about this in some kind of like technical way, but everybody can sort of intuitively sense this. Like if you see somebody who's very calm, open, friendly, consistent, reliable, like they have all of these qualities. So yeah, one way that one metaphor was, yeah, like the sort of spiritual person who's, you feel good being around because they're a reassuring presence, or if you're in a survival situation, who would you want to be there with you is probably going to have these qualities too. Like if you have to, what kind of commanding officer do you want to have if you have to go to war? If you're shipwrecked somewhere, like who would you want to be there with you? Would be somebody who has these qualities. So if you sort of imagine what that sort of person would be like, that's kind of the qualities to cultivate in a resilient person. Yeah, one aspect of this is an emotional aspect, so that they're optimistic. So that's like partly emotional, like having access to positive emotion, and part of it is cognitive. Do you have optimistic ways of viewing things and thinking about things? And so this is like, if you're interested in this, like Martin Seligman's work, positive psychology, learned optimism, you can read more about it there. But yeah, so he talks about like optimistic people tend to think about things in certain ways, that it's like realistic, but it's not overly negative. So they tend to see negative events as being temporary, and also specific, like limited to a certain situation. And they're also they're not personal. Like if something bad happens, it's not like because there's something personally wrong with you, or people are like personally out to get you. Like that stuff just happens. So the permanence, pervasiveness, and personalness, how you view negative events, but also like how you view positive events. Like life is generally good. The dominant state of the universe is kind of benevolent or benign, and in general, life is good. Bad things happen sometimes. And like when things go well, it's because I'm a good person. I have good qualities, good people around me. If negative things happen, well, it was because of some outside factors that are transient. And looking at things in this way like helps people to like engage with negative things and not get too stuck on them, or not get defeated by them. So there's practices that you can read about or do, like how to learn to be more optimistic. Like if you tend to have a lot of these negative thinking patterns, you might start to notice them and dispute them and think like, well, is this actually true? Are there information to the contrary? This is kind of like cognitive behavioral therapy or cognitive therapy. But this might help you even just direct your attention away from these unhelpful thoughts, because you don't, if you start to think, oh, maybe these are not helpful, then you don't cling to them or don't get stuck on them. And directing attention can be another way of like sort of changing thinking patterns too. So an interesting exercise that I find helpful, don't always remember to do, is like just to ask the family, what were you grateful for today, or what was the best part of the day. So you focus more attention on positive things, but also like thinking about like, well, yeah, how were you involved in making that happen? Like what did you do that made it better? So you can start to see your personal involvement in positive things, and that can start to shift the perception of what's your relationship with life? So another thing that seems to be a property of resilient people is this like active coping as opposed to passive coping. So passive coping would just be like waiting for things to go away. Like I'm just gonna sort of numb myself or disconnect or hide until this problem goes away. Whereas active coping is like, what can I do about this? What can I change? Maybe it's something to change about myself or do something about the external situation. So when we we're talking before about dealing with negative emotions, there's this quality of like openness, like how open are you to feeling that feeling and learning something from it. There's some overlap with this concept of active coping, because if you have like a passive coping style, it tends to go along with sort of external locus of control. Like I don't have control over my life. Like it's all because of outside stuff that has nothing to do with me. So therefore, the way of coping with that is just to hide or wait for it to go away or blame somebody else or say, oh, no, this is your fault and you should be doing something about it. And that kind of closes you. So you're not willing to experience things, you get stuck emotionally, and then there's something that you could do, you don't do it. So the opposite is like being able to stay open to the experience and to have more of an internal locus of control. Like I can influence what happens. Maybe I don't control everything, but I have some role to play, or I can take responsibility for some aspect of this, and that is empowering for people. So even if you don't have a lot of options, you still have some, and you exercise the ability to choose. Yeah, like Viktor Frankl, for example, like he wrote this like Man's Search for Meaning, influenced a lot of people, including me. He talked about the experience of Holocaust survivors being in concentration camps and having very constrained options available to them. But he said, you still have the ability to choose your attitude. Like you control at least what's inside you, even if you can't control anything that happens around you. Your movements and your activities are completely controlled by other people, but there's still some internal freedom. So exercising that freedom is an important part of this kind of active coping that I think makes people more resilient and kind of, in his experience anyway, help them to survive very difficult circumstances. So yeah, it's talked about openness. There's flexibility in thinking, being able to see different perspectives, seeing things in a different way. This is a big part of recovering from trauma. I think like when people have trauma, they see things like just in one way, like one perspective. Generally from the perspective of somebody who's very scared, overwhelmed, powerless. And that's what they keep experiencing and keep reliving. So what we want to do to help with that is to help them open that perspective, maybe with some special therapeutic techniques like eye movement desensitization, reprocessing, or just kind of creating that safe space for them so that they can start to see it from different angles, different perspectives. Like, oh, maybe I was powerless then, but I'm not powerless now. Or, this person was abusive at that time, but they weren't always like that. Or they might imagine the situation playing out in a different way, or they might see like, oh, I survived that, not just like, oh, I was a victim of that. there's something that happens where that kind of stuckness like gets shaken up or loosened a little bit, and they might see things in a different way. So yeah, some spiritual practices like mindfulness meditation might have some value with that. Like, just keeping your thinking flexible, like just kind of not getting stuck on your thoughts, being able to notice them, let them go. Then you might be open to seeing different perspectives. And I think talking to different people is also helpful too. Like, it's like a whole other topic, but like just being able to talk to people who have different views than we do or don't see things the same way, like then we learn to see different perspectives. So it's not healthy to be always just wanting to talk to people who agree with us or have the same views. Yeah, and then the moral aspect of resilience, like having some kind of core beliefs that you can hold on to. What's a good way to live? And I think that provides some stability, some reference point, like, well, I'm going through a lot of turmoil or something very difficult. So how do I navigate that in a good way? What are some principles that I can rely on to, keep a sense of integrity in this? And this is also kind of related to trauma, which may be interesting to people. It is like, it seems that there's a strong moral aspect to trauma as well. Like people who have military trauma it's much more difficult to treat those patients than people who have other kinds of trauma. And this is one possibility. I don't know if this has been scientifically validated or not, but it may be because of military trauma involves some kind of moral injury, that people are participating in something that seems wrong. It sort of hurts their soul or their conscience. And so the trauma is much more painful. And yeah, among people who have the military trauma, it seems like the ones who have like participated in some kind of atrocity, they have the most difficulty. So so having some moral principles and actually could be like quite protective, like just from a self-centered point of view. Like if you know that you've done the right thing, like you don't have this many regrets and your self-esteem is better. So yeah, this is maybe something that people have to find for themselves, like to kind of connect with some kind of inner guide or inner teacher, your conscience, like to get a sense of how do I do what's right. This is like different from just following rules or prescribing things, like you should do this, you should not do that. Yeah, that's it's an interesting topic. It overlaps a little bit with psychiatry, but we don't tend to talk about it that much. Yeah, and then social support. We've talked about so much, like all these different stages of grief work. The social support is relevant, and so this is something that we can cultivate before we have any difficulty or loss in creating community or connections with other people, a sense of belonging, so that when we need to call on that help, it's there because we've helped other people. Yeah, and then the physical or bodily aspect I alluded to before, like if we have this kind of internal resistance or stiffness, it shows up in the body too. Like the body sort of becomes over tense, and there's sort of habitual postures, contracting the shoulders, closing the chest, rounding out the back, the legs become stiff. It's yeah, it's almost like the person is like guarding themselves, like so that nothing can come in. Their body becomes like a kind of like a block of wood to try to protect them from injury, but actually you're more prone to being injured if you're so over tense and stiff that you can't move or you can't be flexible. So body-based practices might be a way of addressing this, like different kinds of massage or movement practices, yoga, martial arts, like bringing awareness to the body, finding this tension, opening it, releasing it. That, in my experience anyway, it has some emotional and psychological effects too. Yeah, and then the connection with nature, being outside, also I think gives a different perspective, or connects with a kind of larger view that we are connected with other living things that support our existence. It helps us get out of our sort of narrow view of like, oh, this is me, this is my stuff. So there's this kind of egotistical way of thinking. And so that may give a different kind of safety and security that, like on some deeper level, we're supported, especially if we're like having problems with like human things or social things, like economic difficulties or legal stuff or relationship stuff. Like there's more to life than that. So yeah, it's just to summarize, I think it's this letting go, releasing, flexibility, openness, adaptability, and it's another subject for another talk. But this thing that I mentioned about you need some kind of stress to be able to relax, in a way. Like if you're doing massage, like you kind of press on the area of discomfort or tension, so you know that the tension's there, and then you can work to kind of breathe and unwind it. So kind of connecting back to that idea of post-traumatic growth, or the gold in the wound, is like going through some kind of challenge might actually help you to release more, to open up more than you previously thought you could. So this stuff about COVID advice, may or may not be relevant. I guess we have to see how things are going forward. But I think it's so important for people to be able to gather together, and this is all like become very politicized. So try not to go too much into that, but we have to find some ways for people to be together. Virtual is better than nothing, I think, but it's definitely not the same. But hopefully I made the case that like these kinds of rituals and collective experience are important to process experiences or challenges. And so people need to participate in some way. And there may be losses other losses during the pandemic, loss of job, previous way of living, activity, definitely affecting some people more than others. So what we learn from this, hopefully, with grief and mourning is that if you're not aware of what the loss is and it doesn't feel real to you, then you may not be doing the emotional work with that. So if there has been a loss, we need to kind of inventory that or name it. And yeah, how does the pandemic make people less resilient? Like less social contact, less outdoor activity. You know, we don't want to become like houseplants, being inside to kind of protected from everything, but actually in the longer term, it's not healthy. So also, let me just leave you with that to contemplate. But, so yeah, hopefully now we've talked about a lot of things, but this will help to think about how you might build or cultivate resilience like ahead of time, if not for people you're working with, just for yourself. So it'll be hopefully personally beneficial in that way. And just thinking in different ways about this idea of like opening and allowing the circulation to happen. And yeah, if you are dealing with people who are undergoing grief, bereavement during this time, then yeah, creating some experiences or some way where they can, yeah, that it can feel real, that they can get that sort of support and validation. So I used up almost all the time, and I don't know if how many questions there are, but
it's excellent time. We have a lot of questions, Dr. Allen, but
okay.
throughout your presentation, you answer most of them. I'm going to highlight the one that maybe you need to answer some of them only. So I have this really good questions about most of our clients, refugees and immigrants, are out of the spectrum of normal grief. Most of them have PTSD and they have severe trauma. So can you speak to that a little? And then this one is also tie into that, is that the concept of the delay grief due to PTSD, the time that of the traumatic events or loss tend to resurface tend to surface post resettlement. Sometimes it's manifesting in ways dangerous to their mental health.
Yeah, wow. So yeah, it just came to mind like this idea of like overload or grief overload. Like maybe one reason why people have the delayed reactions is there's too much going on. At the time, like the whole process just shuts down, like it's just too much, too overwhelming. But then it may come out later. So that, I imagine, is probably what you're seeing. Like if people, are going through some kind of displacement or war or some trauma, and then they've come here, like there was just way too much going on at that time. And now maybe if there's a bit more space or not so much like immediate danger, then those emotions might be coming up. And so how do we support those people? I mean, I think there's like other kinds of difficulties too, being here in this different place, different society where things are not familiar, the way of doing things is not the same. I think just our society in general, like we have a different kind of idea about community or how people should relate to one another is very individualistic, and people tend to be kind of separated. And yeah, those kinds of things those are like bigger issues, cultural issues to try to work on or change. And yeah, I don't know all the answers because we're like trying to deal with this stuff too in my line of work, and we certainly don't have it perfected. Like there's so many people who need the services, and only so many of us, so there has to be some other way, like because we can't be just like medicating and giving individual therapy to all of these people, because there's just not enough. I mean, that's one way. It's not that it's bad. Like certainly we can try to do what we can with that, but I think yeah, like just creating this sort of community space or strong communities where people can get the support, where it's not just only in the hands of professional people. I think we have to be moving in that direction, because what I was saying before is like like professional people don't have a monopoly on resilience, or everybody goes through loss and trauma. Like we shouldn't have to have those experiences, but this is relevant to everybody, so we could all learn something of this. I think, like how to heal ourselves, and how to create the space for other people to heal. And yeah, that sort of gets me thinking about like other stuff that's on my mind, or like my own views about like, that if we have this, like we're too materialistic society, or we're just so invested in doing like totally unnecessary activity, like that kind of clamps down how much room we have, or how much bandwidth there is to do this other kind of work. But, so yeah, it's not an easy, simple answer for you, but just some of my thoughts.
All right, thank you for that. And then a few things. The book that you mentioned, can you repeat the name, or can you recite the name of the book that you mentioned earlier?
Oh, like about the optimism? I think it was so Seligman, like Seligman. I think it's Martin Seligman. I can't remember what the book is called, but like that's his area of research. So he's kind of like learned optimism, or there's probably more than one book about it.
Can you spell that again? I like to type it out for the.
Okay. Yeah. Seligman. So Seligman.
Can you? Sorry, I was someone. I was about to type, and someone asked another question. So S-E-L.
Okay. Yeah.
S-E-L.
Yeah. Seligman. I think.
A-N.
Okay. It's something like that.
Oh, Martin Seltzer. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
So thank you, Wenda, for that. Okay. So at this point, if any one of you, if I missed any questions earlier, you can unmute yourself and maybe ask Dr. Allen. We have a few minutes while you unmute yourself. I just wanted to remind everyone that there's a survey. Complete the survey that we just sent out on the chat. It's a Survey Monkey, and that will help us organize more workshop for you folks. Is anyone has any questions for Dr. Allen? At this point, we're perfect timing. but we still have maybe a couple of minutes for someone if they like to. I have someone mention that your workshop is great. It's the best workshop that they ever had, speaker-wise. And your voice is very therapeutic. The slides will be sending out, will be convert to PDF version and send it to OCASI as soon as we complete. I guess at this point, we don't have any.
I have a quick question if you don't mind.
Thank you, please.
Thank you. I'm starting to do support groups for our newcomers, and I really appreciate this webinar because we're going to try to deal with loss. One question is, when setting the parameters for a safe space, how do you tell people that they can share how they feel, but they can't share their personal specific case or stories? Like, is it important to state that when you have a support group, like what the limits are of what they can share?
Oh, yeah. I guess it kind of depends on what kind of group it is too. Like if it's a closed group, like there's sort of certain members, and it's kind of you're meeting with the same people over time. Like you might be able to do something that's more like you can share about your personal experience, and this is confidential, and be respectful of that so people can share more freely. But yeah, if it's like a open group, like it's kind of drop in, or it's a one-shot thing, or just any kind of people can show up, then like maybe one way to handle that is like you could still talk about confidentiality. Like it's important to be respectful of other people, like to create the space where things can come up. But then if people are aware, like, it's an open group, so take that into account, like just for yourself and your own safety, like don't share more than you feel comfortable sharing, because, anybody can come to this group. You might do it like that, because I think it's like hard to talk about how you're feeling, but not talk about like why you feel that way or what happened. So I think I would try, like, if possible, like to create some conditions where people can like talk about their real experience. Because otherwise I think it may become like kind of too distant, intellectual, theoretical, or kind of detached from their emotional experience.
Thank you.
Oh
Thank you
yeah,
for
you're
that.
welcome. Yeah.
So sometimes details can be trigger other people. Yeah. Someone said that sometimes too much details can trigger others.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's true.
At this point, if we don't have any more questions for Dr. Allen, I'd like to, on behalf of Hong Fook and OCASI, I like everyone. I would like to thank everyone to come to this workshop and listen to Dr. Allen. And if you have any questions, you can just send it directly to myself, Kali, or Maria. Kali, would you like to say a few words?
So thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure having you today. And on behalf of OCASI, I mentioned in the chat, you can check out our website, the OCASI Mental Health Promotion website, and we will be putting all of the recordings and slides of our webinars and virtual training sessions on the website to be shared as well. And stay tuned, because we will be having future webinars and trainings coming up. So look forward to seeing you at those as well.
Okay. Oh yeah, so I just have one more thing just related to that last question, because that was a good point. Like too much information can be triggering for people. So I think that's important to recognize. Like I was focused more on the confidentiality part, but one thing that came to mind about that is like when people are sharing things, it's important for them to sort of be present for themselves and for other people too. Like it's not helpful for people to just be like vomiting out like emotion or just like unburdening all of this toxic stuff. Like they have to be able to do it in a healthy way, or kind of remember that like, how is this going to affect me? How is it going to affect other people? And do it sort of respectfully. Like hopefully that helps, or you kind of get the idea about it. But yeah, thanks everyone.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
All righty. Thank you so